Right, hello folks. It's 11 o'clock. Hopefully a few more people will join, but we'll get started because it's only 45 minutes and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So let me turn my camera on, which will hopefully work. So hello, thank you for coming along. This is what we're here to talk about. So backlog management, reduction and eliminations. This is the first SRCN webinar in a potential series, if this one's well received or if we think we're adding a little bit of value. So what we're here to talk about today, if I can get my screen to flick. First of all, this is me. So hopefully those that have joined will hopefully know, you might have seen the LinkedIn profile, but Colin Wilson, so I'm Director at SRCN Solutions, hence the somewhat cheesy mugshot. I've been involved in maintenance and work management for 15 to 20 years now, which is scary to think back. So predominantly in oil and gas. Actually, my first 5 days working within oil and gas were on a work management training course. So from the very start, I've been involved in this subject. Started off maintenance focal point working at Shell, then moved to BP. I led their North Sea backlog reduction programme for a period of time, and then moved into being one of their maintenance engineers for their Harding asset and others. Then became the North Sea work management subject matter expert, and then moved on to Centrica Spinet Energy as the work management excellence lead, leading a work management improvement project. So along with saying, been in and around doing this stuff for a while, founded SRCN Solutions with my co-partner Ewan Galloway. We started it around about 8 years ago and really focused on all things maintenance and work management. So that's me and what we do. So what we'll do is flip on. So outline of the webinar just briefly. So the overview and its objectives, I'll just cover off briefly just now. So really what we're looking to talk about is maintenance backlog. What is it and why does it matter, which is always worth explaining on. The content we're going to cover through is the path to regain control, so the clear inference being that we're not currently in control, and then want to move to a point that we're at least understanding our backlogs and getting on top of them. Touching on what's required from the leadership to regain control, then to sustain that control. So once you've got your backlogs reduced, you've got to try and keep them down, because if they just come back again in that old sawtooth pattern, then you really are chasing your tail. And again, what's required from leadership to sustain control. So a couple of bits really focusing on what's required from leadership, mainly because it really takes a leadership effort to eliminate or reduce backlog to the appropriate level. Without that, it can be really difficult for people to do so without getting full organisational support. So really focus in that area a couple of times. Then at the back end of it, some chat and Q&A, so hopefully there's some time. Just a quick overview on the way we're running the webinar. So it's unfortunately for you a little bit of transmit from me for a while. So because it's only 45 minutes, it's really difficult to get through content if you're taking questions as you go. So we're going to park a little bit and have questions at the end. So if you want to just drop them into the chat, and Catherine, our sales marketing director, will pick them up as we go and loop them back in at the end. And just not to avoid disrupting my flow, I've actually got my incoming audio on mute. So I'll put it back off again when we get to the Q&A session. But if you do ask any questions audibly, I'm not ignoring you. I just can't hear you. So that's what we're here to do and what we'll get into. So first place to start in any conversation about backlog. Backlog itself as a term is one that has got different definitions across different industries, but actually also within the same industry. So within the North Sea oil and gas, multiple operators have got different definitions. So often when you talk about reducing or managing backlog, it doesn't mean the same thing to different people, and it's really important to be clear. So the definition we're choosing to use for this is the OUK definition that can be gained from their guidance. A couple of reasons for using it. So one of them is, I guess, we wrote it on their behalf, so they asked us to come and help them write it. So we're a little bit biased in my next statement, which is, I think it's a really good definition to be clear on how work's being managed and executed and what your backlog actually is. So it provides really good guidance. It's clear and simple and tries to sweep away a lot of the noise that can exist around the topic. So in defining backlog, there's a couple of things to define. The first is really the concept of what it is, and then there's the definition or the calculation about how you derive it. And this is really this slide I want to talk about the first point, which is what backlog's there to represent. So as it says here, and this is from the guidance, backlog represents a deviation from organisational intent. And that's a really important point that then we'll come back to frequently, but I just want to labour a little bit here. Backlog is how an organisation, as a demonstration of how an organisation itself is not executing the work that it itself decided to do. And it's a really important point to keep in mind. So whilst there's legislative obligations, if I can say it properly, the maintenance that an organisation decides to do, it itself has said it has to do in order to meet its minimum business objectives. So it designs its maintenance strategies themselves to make sure the equipment is reliable and available to meet the objectives that it has. And for corrective maintenance, the organisation themselves will assess it and say, this is when we have to do this work by in order to avoid a negative consequence. So it's really, if you have backlog, an organisation isn't doing what it itself says it will do. So a really important point to stick on, because if you're not delivering in your intent to meet your objectives, it's entirely reasonable to change that intent to ensure you're still able to achieve that objective in a different way. And particularly when you're talking about your legislative obligation to make sure you've got a safe operation or safe asset, it's not optional. You have to make sure that you're able to deliver on that requirement. Hence, you can change your intent and how you do it. And that's what backlog's measuring. So the next element of that is, how do you actually calculate it? And again, this graphic we've put together just a bit more visual, but this is the basis for the OE UK definition. And I should say it largely reflects what the Health and Safety Executive are now using as their datum to then figure out what everybody else is doing. So when we talk about backlog for the rest of this webinar, and really when we're talking to clients as well, backlog is any work open beyond its original key risk date, which is the term from the document. So the original key risk date is the date by which your work has to originally complete, either to be in conformance with its maintenance strategy, or is the point you first determine a piece of corrective maintenance has to be executed by. So that's the original key risk date. Many places will call it a target completion date or latest allowable finish date, latest allowable completion date, all similar terms, but they basically mean we have to do this by then, or the risk of a negative consequence occurring becomes too great. So the other important date in defining backlog is the latest key risk date. So once a work order goes beyond its original key risk date, it's in backlog. That is then the position of the latest key risk date that determines if that work is assessed or unassessed. So if the latest key risk date is in the past, the work is unassessed. If the latest key risk date is in the future, the work is then assessed. So when a work order is first created, the original key risk date and the latest key risk date will match. And then when a work order is deferred, the original key risk date will stay where it is, and the latest key risk date will move ahead of it. So the term deferral is just how you reassess your work and move that original key risk date. So it may be a deferral process or a process, any other assessment mechanism that you use to change the date you intend to do the work. That's how you move the latest key risk date, and the original key risk date will stay behind you, so you're clear where it is. So when we talk about backlog, excuse me, for the purposes of this webinar, this is the terms that we're using. And it's important to stress this because it's at this point that many of the rules of thumb that are common in backlog become clearly inaccurate. So to give a couple of examples, one is you often hear the phrase, if you've got no backlog, then you're over-maintaining. And that's one we hear quite frequently. The other one we'll hear is that you have to have between 6 and 8 weeks worth of backlog, and that's optimal, or that's a desirable target. Those guidances or those rules of thumb are based on an alternate definition, which is where backlog is used to describe all live corrective work. So that's almost a term taken from manufacturing, where you have a backlog of orders. So if you're using that definition, then saying that if you've got no backlog, you're over-maintaining, could arguably be correct. If you're not generating any correctives, you may well be over-maintaining your equipment. But if you're talking about it in terms that we're using for this session, then it's work you haven't delivered in line with your intent, and there really isn't any circumstance where it's beneficial not to be delivering in line with your intent. So that's just to explain what we're using as the backlog definition for the course of this webinar. So moving on quickly, so the path to regain control. So the first step in regaining control of excessive backlog is confirming the volume of work scopes that is in that backlog, and I'm being quite specific in the terminology there. So this is the volume of work orders themselves, or the volume of instances of work needing done. It's not the hours, and I'll clarify that in a second. But the first step to doing that is making sure that you're clear on the volume of work. Now, anyone that's had backlog for any significant amount of time will likely have, unless it's been exceptionally well managed, some work in there that's no longer valid. So whether it's a duplicate PM, so you haven't done a monthly PM for 3 months, but you've got 3 callings of that work order in your backlog, you're not going to do that scope of work 3 times. So that's a misrepresentation of the volume of scopes that you have to do. Duplicate PMs. So if you've got multiple correctives to the same work scope that are either all against the same tag, or someone's raised one against a parent in the hierarchy, someone else has raised one further down, but it's all work for the same work scope, really needs cleansed out so you know how many individual work scopes that you have. Other examples are aging work orders. So you've got a work order that's been around for a while that may no longer be valid. A point worth just pausing on with that one is it's another one of those rules of thumb that you'll often hear when people are talking about cleansing backlog, is if a work order has been open for 2 years and it's never hurt us, then there's no point in having it. We can just close it. That really is a bit of a logical fallacy, that one. So if you've got a piece of corrective maintenance, it's not going to heal itself. So unless you've actively carried out some form of work to rectify that defect, it will still be a problem that exists. And if it's existed for a significant amount of time, the likelihood of consequence occurrence will actually go up. So an older work order, unless you've done something, either your operational circumstances have changed or your plant condition have changed or something is different from when it was raised, simply being old is not a justification for closing it. So again, you've got to review your aging work, but make sure that you're not just closing it because it's old. Last example of stuff that might be in your backlog that's inaccurately reflecting it is work open against decommissioned equipment. So this one can often be a contentious one about how it should be managed. So if you've got work against equipment that's no longer operating and it's not been fully decommissioned, an organisation will often have to keep the maintenance against that equipment live until it's fully mothballed, air-gapped and removed from service. But there's never any intent, keyword again, to do this work. So again, there's loads of different ways of dealing with this. You can either close the work, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend because it's not ideal, but you want in some way to capture the organisational intent. You're never going to do it. So you can just have it as assessed backlog, move the target finish date out to the end of field life, and then just have it there as assessed. And it's an important point to note, which is, again, back to what we said at the start, do you actually have to have zero backlog? There's no regulatory intent or desire for operators to have zero backlog. There's a recognition that when you get an aging installation, you're never going to do all the work that's there, nor should you necessarily want to do all the work that exists. But it doesn't mean you want to close it all off. So there's a recognition when stuff gets older, you may have a volume of assessed backlog. As long as you understand what's in it and the backlog's understood, there's nothing inherently wrong with backlog. It's when the understanding of what's in it becomes frayed or degraded, then it no longer becomes acceptable. So if you've got decommissioned equipment, you can just move the date out, and as long as you're clear you're never going to do it, then that's entirely fine. So back to the point in hand. So confirming the volume of work scopes, you've got to be very clear that what you have in your backlog is genuine, valid work that you intend to execute. Again, back to the intent. You've then got to define the import of each one of these work scopes. So essentially, if you've got work that's unassessed, you have to assess that work. You've got to clearly identify the consequence of not doing it, the likelihood of that consequence occurring, including any mitigation that you put in place to either reduce the consequence should it happen or reduce the likelihood of that consequence, and then set a latest key risk date for each of these work scopes so you know when you have to do it by to avoid that negative consequence occurring. And you've got to do that for every work order you've defined is still valid. Now, with that, you will have essentially a load of work with a defined latest key risk date. And the first step in getting back into control and seeing if you can execute this work is building an executable plan or schedule, depending on terminology, for all of that work based on the latest key risk date and whatever level of preparedness that work is. So not all the work you necessarily identify as still needing executed will be fully prepared and ready to be executed. You may not have all the labour requirements against it, all the materials, all the hours, etc. And many would ask, is there any point in building a schedule when you don't know how much hours it's going to take to execute a scope? So the reason I'm saying yes at this point is if you have a maintenance backlog and you're building a schedule that will include all of the backlog that you've just reassessed, all of the corrective work that was no longer in backlog, but you've defined a date already for, and all of your PM burden that you already have identified into the next period of time, so say it's the next 3 months for this example, you're already going to be bust because all of the backlog wasn't built into your resource profile, most likely, when you're designing the resource profile for your asset. So you're already going to be bust. You don't want to spend any time preparing work that you're not going to execute. And the next step of trying to make sure you build an executable plan is being clear at this stage, when you have a bust plan, what it is you're not going to do. And this is a very key point in the management of backlog, is essentially, if you're not deciding explicitly what work you're not going to do, and in doing so, you're basically saying, this is a negative consequence we are willing to let happen, then you're surrendering that outcome to hope by just passively not doing work as you continually try and reprioritize. So what you have to do when you're building this is making sure that your plan is executable, and that's been very clearly in the beginning saying, this is the work that we're not going to do. So in effect, we're going to let this small bad thing happen so that we make sure the large bad thing doesn't. So at the first stage, build a schedule of all your work based on the latest key risk date and see even roughly what does and doesn't fit, and then you have to trim it down to the point that it at least begins to fit. Now, once you've done that, you've identified work that you have to do based on that criteria you've just set. You then have to put exerted effort into fully preparing all the work that's not in that state already. And then you're back in an iterative exercise of all the points we've spoken about in the past. So obviously, you were bust before, you've trimmed to the point that you can meet the demand, you'll be back to being bust once you prepare it. You're then going to have to keep going back through this loop and seeing what work you're actively not going to do until you get to the point that your plan is executable. And this has got to be as realistic as possible. So you've got to try and accurately define what wrench time you're currently getting. You've got to be very clear what tolerance is in the hours that you have, and try and be as clear as possible that this work can be done. If you go forward beyond this point with a schedule that's not executable or as a stretch target, you're really setting yourself up for failure because you're not going to be able to deliver it, and you haven't in the past. So this is about being very clear, make the schedule executable, and actively decide what you're not going to do or what you have to move in order to achieve that. Now, once you've done that, it's about enforcing stringent break-in control for all new work. So this is extenuating circumstances. You really are taking a non-normal business as usual approach to trying to manage this. You're almost trying to treat it like a shutdown. So everyone in most industries knows that shutdowns get much more rigor applied to them than the normal day-to-day. And oftentimes that's because the shutdown rigor isn't sustainable. They can be really high demand periods that are under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of reporting. And to do that in the long term can sometimes feel excessively burdensome. For getting back on top of backlog that may have grown out of control for a number of years, it is exceptional circumstance, and you really have to treat it as such. So enforce stringent break-in control for all new work, and then enforce schedule attainment reviews at an appropriate frequency. So you've really got to make sure that the schedule that you've built is being delivered. There's not excessive fill-in work. You're not having excessive break-in work. You are actually doing what you said you'd do at the start of this. Now, that's not to say there isn't going to be new work comes up that's more important than what's already in, but it's really got to be justified. And again, it's about getting this stringent control in place. So that's the path of getting control. And this all seems like it's very simple when you just run through the bullets, but it'll take quite considerable effort at a number of these stages to get to the point that you're actually building and executing a robust schedule for this work. And it's worth pointing out that in terms of identifying what will not be done to allow demand to meet capacity, that could be quite a difficult step because you will be saying you're not going to do work that you would actually really like to do. There may be some medium criticality PMs that you just can't do because you're dealing with a high criticality corrective. One of the things that can be quite confusing with prioritization is it's not about discounting the thing that you would never want to do and picking the important. Oftentimes you're deciding between the very important and the extremely important, and that's when it becomes hard. So in terms of this step, you really are going to be putting some fairly exceptional measures in place to be clearly defining what you're not going to do. And that then leads us on to the next bit, which is what leadership requirement is there to regain control? And the first bullet is really quite important in this, is acknowledging that there is a problem. So in many industries, backlog's just there and always has been there for the memory of many within the industry. So certainly for my 20 years, 15 years working in the industry, there's always been maintenance backlogs. They're accepted as part of the nature of doing business. And again, all these cliches have grown up round about it of if you've got no backlog, you're over maintaining. 6 to 8 weeks worth of backlogs, the target, all this stuff to essentially justify it being there. There has to be acknowledgement that it's grown to the point that that's not acceptable. So there's a paradigm shift, to use a horrible phrase, And that's got to be led quite actively, and the leadership have to be front and centre of that. So the first step, acknowledge there's a problem, and then lead in that belief. So and this is a really important point of note for often maintenance managers and engineering managers and others, is that the justification of backlog has really become quite habitual within many industries now, because to say you're not managing it well is to imply you're not in control of your risk, and nobody wants to make that admission. It's a really uncomfortable one to make, but you have to get there in order to get on top of it, and it really needs the leadership to lead in that belief, which is A, this is no longer acceptable, and secondly, this is the new standard. We want to get to this point and we're going to do it. And this leads on to the third bullet. So ensure the intent of any backlog reduction effort is understood. In many industries, there's been a legacy of backlog reduction in a sawtooth method, so that it climbs and climbs and climbs. There's an intervention, it drops, and then it comes back up again. And that's been the cycle in many industries for decades, essentially. And because of that, unfortunately, many times that that's been achieved, it's been done in a suboptimal way. So the reduction's been done that many would view as just making the figures come down, but not actually solving the problem. So it's being fudged in effect. So whether that's significant number of hours being deferred by a single deferral on the 31st of December to meet a target for the year, or many PMs have been closed and corrective raised in their stead, or a load of work's been filtered out of the backlog figure because it's live work that it wants to do, but it's not met an appropriate status. All of this stuff. Essentially, leadership have to be very clear what the intent of the backlog reduction is, which is to make the work execution sustainable, make sure the risk is being managed and the business objectives are met, and we're delivering on our intent. So it's got to be very clear the intent behind it. And following swiftly on from that is making very clear what methods of reduction are acceptable versus unacceptable. And that's back to the points I've said in the past. For many people, if the leadership asks a backlog to come down, then it will be interpreted that that just means anything's acceptable to try and get the number to come down. And it's always done, in my view, very rarely with nefarious intent. It's normally done with good intent. So when people filter things out of backlog or close things out and raise a follow-up and all the rest of it, it's done with a view of trying to do what they think is expected or what's helpful. It's not done to hide things, but oftentimes that's what it results in. So you've got to be very clear as a leadership when you're asking for backlog to come down, what way you would like it to come down and what way you wouldn't, and making sure that that intent's been delivered against. And the final point, provide support necessary. And this really is an essential one. So as I've said in the past, there have been many attempts to reduce backlog across the industry before. It keeps coming back, and we're at the point that it really does need the leadership support to provide that assistance necessary to get in control of the problem. And that may well be fending off other work that comes in, or staying the course, or providing more money, or whatever it is. It's really acknowledging that the problems there, bring me your problems and issues that only leadership can resolve, and working with the organisation to fix it. It's not something at this point that can be delegated further down the organisation, because it's such a seismic shift needed. You really need the leadership to step in and support it where necessary. And that leadership can be at whatever level of seniority is appropriate to have the authority and capability to really deliver the work. So that's required to regain control. And after that, also on a similar theme and similar steps, you've got to sustain that control. And again, it's about avoiding this sawtooth, which is what essentially you need, particularly when, as I said, backlog is a measure of whether the organisation is delivering on its own intent. And it really isn't acceptable for an organisation not to deliver on its own intent, because otherwise it can't guarantee it's going to meet its objectives. So how to get the control sustainable? The first step is to review the existing maintenance strategies to ensure they are ALARP. So that's as low as reasonably practicable to achieve business objectives and the legislative obligations. So essentially you want to say, what's the minimum amount of maintenance I can do that can meet the objectives of the business? How do you make the equipment reliable and available enough to meet our objectives? Second step is confirming your PM/CM ratio to determine expected corrective volume. So this isn't about how much corrective maintenance you've executed versus your PMs. This is about how many times you will execute a PM, how many correctives will be generated. So that isn't always easy to get to if the data quality isn't high enough, but you've got to get to the point you understand how many correctives you're raising for every PM in some way, because you are going to get correctives, otherwise you're over-maintaining, as I say. So you've got to factor that into any build of your resource profile going forward. and you've got to determine your realistic current range time. So you've hopefully already done this in the step behind, but you've really got to be very clear what's your current range time, so you can really be clear you've got enough resource to execute the demand coming at you, and that's the objective of these steps. And then that's the resource review. So you're looking at the work demand versus your execution capability and seeing have I got enough people to be on top of this, at least for 12 to 24 month workload. Now, the reason that we've got this is really targeted at getting the resource high enough or the demand low enough is any improvement in range time can be quite a long process. So trying to say that we're going to have massive increase in range time in 3 months and factoring that in for your resource demand isn't really setting yourself up for success. So you want to be looking at your execution capacity far enough ahead that you're giving yourself a chance to get on top of this stuff. So if you've met 1 to 4 and your resource demand meets your execution capacity, carry on, deliver, and you're hopefully there at the point of sustainability, and you've just got to keep it going. But once again, if there remains an imbalance after you've done that review, you're back into the loop again. So you're back to point 1. If we can't execute the work in line with our intent, we have to again look to reduce the maintenance strategies further so the demand drops. If you don't believe you can do that, so you can't maintain your equipment any less to meet your business objectives, you've then got to look at, well, what corrective maintenance can we reduce? So if you're not going to maintain more, then you're unlikely to reduce your corrective volume unless you change your maintenance strategy approach, obviously, but again, longer term. So your other alternative is you just say, this is the negative consequence we're going to accept happening, in effect, moving it from corrective maintenance into fix and failure or breakdown maintenance. And that will reduce the volume of small scale correctives. Now, this one can be a bit contentious because there's arguably, does one breakdown constitute far more effort than numerous corrective scopes? Arguably it does. Again, you've got to try and be clear that what you're doing in terms of a resource demand meets your resource execution capability, and part of that is not fixing every corrective that comes up. So an option available. And the third point 3, can you improve your efficiency? So if you can't increase the supply of a resource, you have to increase the yield you get from it, hence drive up the range time. So again, that is an option, a longer term one, not something you can typically do overnight. But again, these are the steps you have got to keep going through until your resource demand meets your execution capability. If you can't do that, then you're setting yourself up for failure and it'll never be sustainable. So you've got to very clearly define this. And final bit of me talking before we get some questions, hopefully, is the leadership requirements to sustain control. So this is not just about what leadership have to do to lead their organisation, but what they also have to do for themselves. And I guess the first 2 points are really tied together with that. Is there's got to be the clear expectation set that changing this way of working is a priority until it's sustainable. So there's not going to be new initiatives. There's not going to be a drift in focus. It's not going away in effect. This has to become the new way of working. Similar to the change to healthy lifestyle is you can't be healthy for a month and then that's you set and you're healthy and go back to your old ways. It's really got to be a permanent change. And that's, again, part of leadership. I've got to be clear with themselves. It's not a short-term activity to do this. They've got to be prepared to stay the course in doing it. And that's on to the third bullet, which is resist the temptation of improvement functions to move to a new initiative before this one's complete. And this is one that I think many that have been involved in any work management improvement in the past will probably recognise. It needs to be understood by an organisation in the beginning that the senior leadership and those at the forefront of the initiation of an initiative will be talking about this oftentimes 18 months before the training of that initiative is complete. So in effect, they're talking about it 18 months before many technicians and supervisors are seeing it for the first time. That can lead to the belief that we've been talking about this forever, we must have done it by now, what's next? And there's a moving on to a new way of working long before the change that they want in the organisation is actually embedded and in place. And that's about patience from a central leadership perspective. Is you have to understand when you go into this, this has to be a priority for the long term. If you genuinely want the change that you say at the beginning, now they could obviously change what they want, and you can change the expectation. But if you're going to set a high standard for what you want to deliver, be aware that you have to be willing to stay the course to get what you want at the end of it. And that's got to be consistent. So communicate this is an organisational priority, demonstrate it by actions, not just words. So kicking out major modification scopes if it undermines the effort to stay on top of backlog.
not reducing resources if it will result in an increase in backlog that's unacceptable. There's really got to be a demonstration in actions, not just in the we want zero. You've got to actually do something. And because it's long term, there's a big role in leadership at all levels to reinvigorate the enthusiasm and focus for backlog management when it will invariably drift over time. When you do something for a long time, it becomes mundane and you're looking to do something different. And oftentimes the people that are left holding the tiller of a change long after everyone else has moved their focus away really feels undervalued in doing so. So the schedulers or supervisors or people that are still trying to manage their schedule, prioritise the work, get a robust execution in place, they're lost in the noise of new initiatives and not really recognise what they're doing. You've got to be willing to recognise that and keep the enthusiasm for the change and restating why it's important. And it's got to become part of overall business performance reviews. So this can have a strategic impact. I'll touch on in a second with the budget. The delivery of an organisational intent is how a strategic objective is met. So if you've got an asset that's supposed to produce X production for X number of years, that's the strategic basis for many organisations. Whatever product you produce is how you make profit for the company. Anything that can potentially undermine that objective of the organisation will get leadership focus and is of strategic import. So it has to be viewed in those terms. So in any performance review session, whether it's quarterly, monthly, annually, at some point, the question of are we doing what we said we'll do to allow us to meet the assumptions that we're delivering against has to be asked, and that's got to perform on the basis of the strategic review as well as tactical implementation. And that should then make the next step actually one of the easier ones. So getting budget available always seems like it's the hard step, but like I said, from a senior leadership level, they want to make sure their business is delivering on the business promises. Now, I accept expenditure is part of that, but fundamentally, if you're a steel manufacturer, you manufacture steel. That's what your business is based on. Anything that undermines your capability to manufacture said steel will be of leadership focus. So for a lot of maintenance managers and engineering managers trying to get budget to manage maintenance backlogs or get on top of them, it's actually about making sure you're articulating the risk in those terms, and then getting the budget available is normally fairly straightforward. If leadership's reluctant to give you budget, you haven't made the case in a language they understand yet. So that was about whistle stop. A lot of me talking for, I think, it was like 30 odd minutes, which is a lot for anyone. So what I'll do is I'll stick the sound off. I'll go to the next slide and I'll see if there's any questions. Catherine, are you there?
I am. If you click on the Q&A tab, you'll see that I have a question that was sent to me from someone who couldn't make it along earlier. If you can see that. And if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to post them on there. Can't hear you, Colin. Colin, you're on mute.
Rookie move in all these years of using Teams. I do apologise. I was reading, so Ken McPhail asked the question. I was reading it to myself because I thought everyone could see it, but I'll read it so in case you can't. So the question is, some operators are less proactive in backlog management. Do you think external organisations or regulators, e.g. HSE, NST, OEUK, are doing enough to challenge operators on backlog and insisting on remedial plans to mitigate? So I think that the pressure in the space is obviously increasing. But I think it's worth being clear what each organisation's role is within doing that. So the OEUK, for example, its role is to support the industry and try to manage its operations, if you like. It's an industry representative forum. So they're really about making sure that the operators themselves are understanding the need, but they're not. It's not really about them challenging. It's about trying to support. The HSE is very much about making sure that operators are delivering on the targets. And I think the focus of the HSE in this sphere has ramped up considerably in the last 3 or 4 years. So when I said we helped the OEUK write the guidance document, excuse me, that was basically written out of the OEUK's maintenance backlog task finish group.
which is a task finish group set up by OUK to get all the operators in the North Sea together and really tackle the problem of backlog that's been existing for some time. The catalyst for that forum being set up was the HSE asked for it, in essence, by saying that after COVID, maintenance backlogs had risen to an unacceptable level in their view, but they were categorical in saying that this has exacerbated a problem that already existed before COVID. So their view was that backlogs were unacceptable before, and COVID just made the situation worse. Now there's a desire to get it back down again. But I think you can see, and if you check the HSE website where they publish all the improvement notices that they give, there's clearly a trend towards them being much more active in trying to manage and reduce backlogs and try and push them in the right direction. But I think organisations themselves have to take a bit of ownership for that. It's the potentially poor analogy I always use is it doesn't really need the police to stop me taking 5 pints and then driving my car. I know myself it's not something that I should be doing. And again, that's back to leadership setting this expectation, which is we can't continue to have high backlogs in the way we're having them. We have to get back on top of them. And the HSE have a role to play in that. And I think they're doing much more. But I think just relying on them to do it isn't necessarily what we should be doing. Bob, I think I saw your hand up at some point, did I? Put it back down again.
Hi, Paul. How
Hey,
you
Bob.
doing? Yeah, we were all still muted there, so nobody can speak to you.
Apologies.
Hey, what's your thoughts with regarding calculating wrench time in an organisation that's not particularly driven?
Good question. So, calculating wrench time is difficult, and I guess you yourself know, Bob, that there's ways to do it accurately. So whether you're doing it by statistical, somebody goes out and checks X number of times a day that someone's working and that counts towards getting wrench time, whether you do day in the life of studies or whether you've got people carrying watches that buzz and you record what you're doing at the time. There's loads of ways of doing it, all of which are fairly painful and none of which people necessarily like the results they get from. So a lot of it is really about trying to look at what you're executing from a schedule attainment perspective and looking historically at have you done all the work we said we're going to do, and it's going to be rough. So it's doing it well and accurately is expensive, time consuming, and ultimately often morale sapping. So your workforce can feel you're watching them and you're making sure they're working, which feels a bit Big Brother state these days. I think a more passive way of doing it is trying to really involve your workforce in what they can do and do an analysis of what you've been delivering and seeing where the backlog is coming from. But I think it's probably fair to say getting an accurate answer on that is really, really difficult. There's a lot of that about the judgment of the organisation, which probably may not be that helpful an answer, but I think setting yourself up with what I wouldn't encourage people to do is set a stretch target on it. So say we get 9 hours out of a 12-hour day. I think the latest figure I saw with world-class wrench times in the region of 55%, and that's world-class. That's not just middle of the pack. That's exceptional. So I think people thinking they're getting 9 hours of a tech on tools, you're not setting yourself up for success on that basis. So I think trying to set yourself as minimum 6 hours a day, or sorry, maximum 6 hours a day. I suggest a little bit lower is probably the place to base yourself, but actually measuring it, as you'll know, there's no easy answer on that one, unfortunately.
No, none at all. And especially if you go out with data capture devices, I'm sure a lot of them would end up overboard. The first time we try that, and also the just even what you're doing, people are immediately going to think it's about cost savings and manpower reductions. So it's one 100%. I'm struggling with at the moment because the more people you ask, they'll come up with these totally unrealistic figures of we're scheduling to 9 hours and things like that, which is we know it's just not.
Yeah, they're just not
possible. Either that or your estimates are very wrong in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. So you may be scheduling to it. I'd be surprised if you're executing to it, and if you are, I'd be questioning how much fat you've got in your hours.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. No, good answer. Thanks.
Mr. McCautry, I think you were next. I don't know if you're able to mute yourselves or not. Oh, sorry, fire myself.
Sorry, just addendum to what Bob's asking there, really. Having been on the sharp end of trying to assess wrench time, it's much like backlog. It's making sure there's a clear definition in the organisation. That's the very first step. Otherwise, you get all sorts of people coming out with their own pet definitions, and like you said, the pressure. You're trying to get rid of people. Actually, no, work management is trying to do more with the same people, etc. So it's just very, very important. I've been on the angry side of that. I've been told to do all sorts of things and possibly swim home as well. So yeah, very important, very emotive.
Nobody likes someone watching if they're working hard enough.
Oh, crumbs now.
Mr. Laurie, saw your hand up. And you put it down again. One's back up again.
Yeah. No, I was just to continue on the bench time thing, similar to what Bob was saying. I'm kind of, and recognizing some of the challenges Andy's talking about, I'm kind of looking at just a macro inputs and outputs, top down counting, rather than kidding ourselves that either the estimates that are in our jobs are actually based on a tight definition of wrench time, somebody actually holding a tool, or that the hour confirmations, the time written against the jobs, is based on a tight definition of wrench time. I think for the reasons that you and Bob and Andy were talking about, that's really difficult to implement. So I guess I'm kind of in the place where if the estimates are in that currency that isn't real wrench time, but we're able to get some measure of stuff getting done and some measure of actuals getting written against it, even if there is a bit of a bias to make those more like a big day than just 5 hours, then I think there is a balance that can be managed from that macro numbers in, numbers out point, but difficult.
Yep, agree. Okay, do we have any more for any more?
There's one there in the Q&A. I'll read it to you, Colin. Senior management often say that they have no backlog. How can they check that this is a true reflection on the status rather than an over-optimistic view of the truth?
Yeah, so yeah,
There you
good
go.
question. We often hear from clients, well, actually, we often hear from people who would wish to be clients. Oh, we don't need any help. We don't have any backlog, and I have to say that immediately start ringing my alarm bells. I think it's been very clear what the definition of backlog is. And if a senior leader has been told that we don't have any backlog, I'd probably take the time to understand what the definitions are that we've used in this webinar, which is no work open beyond its original key rest date, and then go back and ask, are you very sure we don't have any maintenance that we don't do by the original key risk date? And if the answer to that is yes, then I guess I'd be starting to look at whether I've got what my resource levels are, whether they're appropriate. Now, I know you should never have backlog in terms of you're delivering on the organisational intent, which is what I said earlier, but not having any would be incredibly unusual. So I think it's been very explicit what terms that you're asking for, and been very clear what you do and don't want filtered out of it. So you just want the absolute worst case scenario. And I'd be surprised if there's many organisations that have got no backlog. And if they don't have any, I'd love a chat with them to see how they've done it. And actually, I don't know whether I'm just looking in the wrong place, Catherine. I can only see the Kenny McPhail question. I'm looking in the wrong place, the Q&A.
I put it in a comment within that. So, but that's all that was there.
Okay. Well, actually, I must be running behind. I just saw Bob say we all still muted, so I must be running behind on it.
Cole, I've got another one. With your work that you've done with OE UK, are you seeing a general trend of operators with higher deferment hours? And where I'm coming from, you're traditionally going back 10, 15. If we had 2 or 3 deferments, in a month, you'd be questioned quite severely by, production managers, etc. Whereas now it almost seems to become normalised, that we're assessing and deferring thousands of hours in front of us now. It almost seems to have gone from one extreme to another. And my point is the risk is obviously increased because you can't see the wood from the trees because you've deferred so much now.
Yes, is the short answer. So there has absolutely been a shift from unassessed to assessed work, which I guess is by design. So the in terms of that workshop, one of the very strong messages from the HSE in the workshop was it's not acceptable to have an unassessed risk because it's an unknown. So it's just a flat unacceptable because you don't know if the bad thing's going to happen. So that message was largely, I guess, heard loud and clear by those involved. And there's been a lot of effort put into assessing the work, but the mechanism for capturing that assessment is by deferral. So I think, yes, there has been an increase in the volume of work being deferred. I think the volume of work not being done in line with organisational intent remains about the same as it's always been, if that makes sense. So I don't see backlogs overall dropping. I just see the volume of deferred work to make it assessed backlog is definitely going up, yeah.
Yeah, I think in some organisations, the effect of that is, because it's in front, it's almost then ignored. You know, there's none of the mechanisms put in place to then get after that bow wave coming towards you, you know.
Yeah.
So they see, the first thing they see is backlog goes down. That's a good thing, so we're doing well. And they take that metric in isolation rather than, you know, the combination of deferred hours in front and what's left in backlog.
Yeah, I think it's 100% part of the challenge of because the OUK definition isn't universally adopted as being the internal measure, which it doesn't have to be. It wasn't designed to be that. But if the internal measure is if you defer something, it comes out of backlog. So not counts as assessed backlog, is just out of backlog. There is a danger for it all to become hidden. It's part of the, I mean, a lot of the emphasis this falls on the maintenance leadership and the owner of the KPIs is to make sure that the full intent of the KPI has been understood by the senior leadership. And I actually know there's a lot of effort by OUK to try and do that. They're doing process safety leadership visits to operators to try and explain what the metrics are doing and how they're used. But yeah, I think that there's always a danger that if the leadership aren't active in the management of the backlog question, just deferring something makes them think it's all okay, which is really a flawed understanding that I think all of us understand that are going to have to try and work harder to make more visible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okie doke. Catherine, any others that I've in my incompetence not seen?
No, I think that's everything. And we're just
Cool.
past the time as well. So
Yeah,
if there's anything
over.
else, do a one-to-one.
Ken's
there's one
swept in
from
at the
Kenny.
end. Oh dear. Based on his earlier question, this is going to be a tricky one, I think. I've not met him before, Ken, but I think this will be a challenger.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me, Colin?
Yeah, sure can. Fire away.
Good. Thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, well worthwhile. I did post another question that I don't think Catherine picked up on. Earlier this year, the Energy Voice had an article which noted HSE concerns on safety deficiencies and high backlog in the North Sea.
Yep.
Now, there's been a lot of talk in the relevant bodies about this, but we still obviously have an issue. I've written to the HSE numerous times in the last year and government on this, and the responses have been, quite frankly, been inadequate.
Yep.
I would like to know just exactly, is there still a fear why the guys offshore are reporting concerns? There doesn't seem to be, and I know they say they can stop the job. That's a no-brainer. Nobody's going to go against that. But I think still something in the background that there might be the issues are not being possibly thoroughly reported. That's why I asked the first question about HSE taking more of an involvement in demanding responses from operators, because some operators are good at managing backlog and others are not.
Yeah. So I think I thought it was a difficult question. It's quite wrapped up in a lot of different things, that one. So backlog is accepted in the North Sea for many that are within it. It's interesting the response I get to many when I start saying backlog isn't acceptable. It can be very vigorously defended against. And the OUK definition, for example, the backlog is described as being deferred and undeferred, is the language actually used in the guidance document. I've moved away from it for the purposes of this. The reason for that is some operators didn't want to call it unassessed because they thought it was too damning, for want of a better expression. So I think that the industry accepts backlog, and I don't think the people that are responsible for assessing backlog genuinely think there's a risk, because they think all the mechanisms, controls are in place to manage it. And I just don't think they're right, is my personal view. But I think getting them to change that acceptance is the hard bit. So you really want people to move away from thinking backlog is inevitable to why have we got that. And I made a post on LinkedIn a while ago, which is I find it really interesting. If you explain to somebody not in oil and gas what safety critical backlog is, particularly preventive, but also corrective, and then what it means, but how much of it there is and what's their reaction, everybody I've ever done that with has been genuinely shocked. Like, they can't believe oil and gas don't maintain gas detectors, fire pumps, lifeboats, all that stuff. But the industry accepts it and views that response as being uninformed. You think, I know it sounds bad, but, and I think the but is what we now need to change. So, and again, that's why I was touching on the leadership view. So I think the guys offshore have got a real, my sense, is a deep degree of cynicism about any backlog reduction. So I don't know if that answers your question. That's my view. I don't think they necessarily think enough's being done, but it's a hard thing to get your head round. I think the gap is that the maintenance leadership and the engineering leadership accept this high figure because it's what they've always got, and they trust their ORA procedures and they trust their cumulative risk and the bow ties and all the rest of it, and a lot of quite sophisticated risk management tools. But I think that's giving them a false sense of security, and I think that's where the leadership really needs to change that view, that paradigm, which is we no longer find this acceptable, and that's what's required. So, but I think whenever somebody's asked the question, do you think the backlog's too high? There isn't a universal response to say yes yet. I attended the OE UK Asset Integrity Task Finish Group a while ago, where everyone had been asked to rank their own degree of risk related to the backlog on a 5x5. So is it extremely high, acceptable, whatever? And everyone said it's moderate risk, moderate, and it was just slap bang in the middle. And I got then said, well, if I was leadership, you'd say, so what? So why would I react to that? If it's just moderate, moderate. That's no call to action when I've got all these other things that people are screaming about, saying how important they are. But it's the people that would like to fix it that are saying moderate, moderate. It's the engineering managers and the maintenance managers and the people involved in the risk management. So I think that has to shift for the messaging to shift, for action to be taken. So, and I think that's the challenge before us. Those that understand it, I guess we've got to try and do better in saying this isn't acceptable. This has to change. And I think that's back to your earlier question, where the HSE really do have a role, which is if you're not going to stop having 4 pints and driving, then I'm going to start prosecuting you and it's 1 pint or it's no pints. So that's where they can play the role. But in terms of the industry themselves accepting it, I think that's where we've got some way to go. So if that answers your question, no, it's got a rambling answer, but it's not an easy one.
No, that was fine. Thanks very much for that comment. It's obviously an emotive subject and you can talk about it for years and years. But I know with my number of years offshore that there are issues, and
100%.
we really need to, we need to be starting to ask the awkward questions and challenge leadership rigorously.
Yeah, 100% agree. 100% agree.
Right, thanks for that. Thanks very much.
No worries. Okay, doke. I've massively ran on now, so hopefully it's helpful for people. If not, just drop me an email and tell me to shut up the next time. And Catherine, I don't know if there's any roundup you need, or is that us done?
No, I think just thanks all for attending. I will send you on a copy of the 14 steps report and also a copy of the video, the recording of this webinar as well. We will have further webinars. I think that went well, Colin. So we'll have another one and we'll let you know when that is, and send you out an invitation to that. But thank you for attending and thanks for the interaction. It's appreciated.
Thank you, folks.
Cheers, guys.
Okay,
Cheers.
cheers.
Thank you very much.